the IFSC out. I'll invite the next panel to discuss more in terms of their experience as to what was it like setting up in the IFSC and where do they see IFSC going from here. I think with those perspectives, we could surely see IFSC 2.0, which probably is a fund management hub based out of India and investing all across the world as well. So I would like to call upon stage Tushar, partner PwC, as the first panelist. Then Mr. Subramaniam Krishnan Subbu from partner EY on the stage, please. Then we have Nandini Pathak, leader investment funds practice NDA. We have Siddharth Pai, founding partner, chief financial officer and ESG officer, 314 Capital. We have Shagoofa Rashid Khan, group general counsel and head corporate affairs, NIIF. Thank you to the panelists for being here and sharing their perspectives with us. I would like to give the mic to Tushar now for moderating the session. Over to you, Tushar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rohan. And I think we had insight being shared by Mr. Praveen Trivedi from IFSCA in terms of IFSC setup. So we now have, of course, a very august panel, people from legal background and people who have like, Shagoofa was like, from the right now part of NIIF, but been in legal background and earlier with the funds as well. And we have Siddharth, who's kind of setting up his own fund in IFSC. I heard that being the first foreign capital fund that he's setting. And we have Subbu, who has all the experience, and Nandini from NDA on the legal side. So let me just start because we have a very limited time. So I would start first with maybe ask Nandini to provide us in terms of, as you know, IFSC is actually a hybrid model, right? So it's a non-resident of EMA. So its intent is, of course, to onshore the offshore financial services players. So instead of, can you look at IFSC as a fund jurisdiction compared to the offshore financial centers? And maybe Nandini, can you just throw some light? There is a new FME regulation, fund management entity regulation, which are announced by IFSC authorities in April of 22. So maybe it would be a good idea to just start with that in terms of giving some overview. And so what are those regulations at a broad level? And then we can move on in terms of practical experiences and people trying to set up funds and what challenges or ease that they're facing.
Sure, thanks Tushar. I think I'll be quick. Like you said, Mr. Trivedi covered a lot of things in great detail right before this. So quickly, the fund management regulations of IFSCA that were released last year actually radically changed the way the asset management industry is regulated in IFSC to bring it at par with global standards. I think Mr. Trivedi also mentioned that the idea is to regulate the manager and not the fund. And they have consolidated different types of asset management activities. So it's not just alternative investment funds, but also your portfolio management services, your mutual funds, REITs, InvITs, right? So to quickly summarize, they have adopted a risk-based approach to categorize fund management entities under these regulations. There are three categories. The first is the authorized fund management entity. This entity is, I would say, the least regulated. It can launch venture capital schemes, family investment funds, and under venture capital schemes, even angel funds. The angel fund framework and the venture capital scheme framework is special and less regulated because it has a green channel. So you could just file your PPM with the authority and launch immediately thereafter. You don't need to wait for feedback. So that's the special feature. Now, in case of a family investment fund, it is envisaged as a self-managed vehicle. So you don't really need an external FME. The pooling vehicle itself will have the manager as a management shareholder or as the trustee if it is a trust, right? So that's the family investment fund subcategory under authorized FME framework. The second category is registered fund management entity non-retail. This, as the name suggests, covers products which are, not for retail audience. So your category 1, 2, 3 AIFs get covered in this. Portfolio management services get covered in this. And privately placed REITs and InvITs also get covered in this category. It's interesting to note that what a registered FME non-retail can do, it can also do what an authorized FME can do, right? So under this license, you get to do what an authorized FME can do as well as what you can do as registered FME non-retail. And the third category is registered FME retail, which again, as the name suggests, allows you to manage retail products or InvITs, REITs, which are not privately placed, and ETFs and similar strategies, right? So that's the broad categorization, Tushar. I just wanted to set the context.
Thank you. And as you rightly pointed out, it's more of a risk-based approach. Even Mr. Trivedi said that, right? That as you go from a sophisticated investor to the retail investor, the regulation changes based on the risk that you're taking. Maybe said, let me come to you because you have been raising domestic money, operating domestic funds. For the first time, you're raising offshore money. And I assume that you did your homework, knowing you would have gone around the world and checked which is the best place to kind of set up this fund. And you chose IFSC. So I wanted to ask you as to your thought process and to why you did that. And how has been your experience in terms of setting up this fund in IFSC?
So thanks a lot for that, Tushar. Actually, what we've done is this is the first time we're actually going overseas to set up a structure. We've actually had overseas investors go through the entire process of coming onto the Indian AIF itself. Yeah. Because from our side, one of the reasons why we chose IFSC also is that the promise that IFSC has to the entire industry. If you look at the asset management industry across the entire world as of now, it's actually Indian intellect that powers a large amount of the capital that actually goes and is invested around the world. You look at the largest tech companies, there are Indian CEOs. Look at the largest funds as well. There are Indians as part of the key management team, the key investment team, the directors, as well as large shareholders in all these entities itself. So I think the fact that IFSC actually GIFT IFSC allows Indian fund managers and Indian talent to actually realize their aspiration of actually managing global pools of capital along the same regulations and the same guardrails that any other fund jurisdiction has. You look at Singapore, you look at Dubai, you look at what the SEC has in the US, look at what happens in EU and everything for that matter. All of them have this approach where they will regulate the manager rather heavily to make sure that manager is actually compliant, they have prudent norms, they do actually follow what's actually required. And then they allow the primacy of contract between the investor and the manager. So long as the investor and the manager agree that this is the way the money needs to be managed, then it's easier for them to actually end up doing so. There are no other regulations, stipulations, investor protections, and the like. The respect for the sophistication of the investor, I think, is a paramount part that Indian fund managers were actually delighted to see happen on the shores of India itself. And given the fact that there is a wide-ranging movement in India right now to ensure that we onshore the offshore, India doesn't require an intermediate geography to actually invest into its own country. I think we have a fairly evolved capital market, very, very strong regulations that are there, and fantastic assets that the country has. So why do we need an intermediate geography in order to invest in here? I think that fed into a thought process and something that we at 314 also subscribe to very strongly, and that's why we actually decided to start up in GIFT IFSC itself. It's been a delight. I'll be honest with you. This is the first time in my fairly limited career, and I've spoken to other people who've had longer careers than me, where they've said that the regulator is attentive, the regulator listens, and the regulator is responsive. You can actually reach out to the regulator on WhatsApp, for that matter, which is fantastic. They don't give you anything that's a state secret, but they give you comfort that, yes, we are actually backing you. And as an investor in startups, to have a regulator who's also a startup is actually refreshing. And to see the kind of energy that they end up bringing about. As Sir also said, they have the entire fintech sandbox. In case you actually have something that's truly innovative, we often suffered, India especially suffered from the fact that innovation has been stifled by regulation. We finally have a regulator say, if you are innovative, we will give you a green channel, we'll give you a green carpet to end up experimenting. And when you're done with your experimentation, in a limited way, of course, we'll actually see how to regulate you the best way, rather than force-fitting you onto existing regulations. So I think the freedom and the liberal attitude of the regulator is actually refreshing. It is completely supportive of capital, and it's not anathemic to what capital has. I think these are the principles that we've espoused from our side. We are excited and elated at the fact that the regulator has it, which is why we've actually chosen GIFT. And GIFT should become the de facto option for a number of asset managers and fund managers looking to have the best of global practices very, very close to India itself. I mean, the flight to Gujarat from anywhere India is far shorter and far easier than the flight to any of the other pooling geographies that are actually around India itself. That convenience itself goes a long way in making it a lot easier and making it a simple choice.
Thank you, Sid, for sharing the thought process. Maybe Shagoofa, you want to come in here? I know you've been now with NIIF, but in the past, you've been on the other side, being advising clients in terms of fund setup in IFSC. So do you have a view in terms of how difficult, easy is setting up an IFSC?
Sure. So I think from an external counsel perspective, we went through a learning ourselves, because we as advisors were used to speaking the language that the LPs understood, be it the Singapore jurisdiction or Mauritius jurisdiction. So we literally started from ground zero. Setting up is one aspect, administration during the life of the fund is a second aspect, and the third aspect is of course winding up and enforcement. So I think it took us a long time to even educate and engage with our clients, not just the domestic fund managers, but the LPs who are looking at investing into India, that yes, GIFT City is coming up and it will address all your concerns in terms of how the structure will work. As fundamental, as in a feeder vehicle, it's very common for the managers to take a back leverage when they're investing into Indian SPVs or Indian investments. And we were asked questions from the bankers. So what will be the governing law for the loan documents? How will we be able to enforce these documents when we are looking at a gift vehicle which is doing a back leverage? So we went through that curve. I think what's still a little pending in that sense is the question on enforceability. So it was good to hear the FM announce that there is a plan to address the dispute resolution mechanism. The point that we have to bear in mind is that, when the SEZ Act came about, there was no context of it being utilized in financial services, parameters or products or even investors who would be consuming those services. So the SEZ Act in that sense is completely dehors of what we are used to as a financial services industry. For example, if you look at Section 23, which talks about enforcement, it says that the state government where the SEZ is located can notify courts, special courts, to actually sit and decide upon notified offenses. Now, the notified offenses are only in relation to foreign trade as far as today's law is concerned. So it's heartening to hear the FM that yes, this anomaly will be addressed, because we do need special courts. It's not that everything can be simpliciter, outsourced on the arbitration front. So we need to fundamentally address the framework from an enforcement perspective. What is also happening in parallel is that, of course, in GIFT City, again, the announcement from the government is that we will be having an international commercial arbitration center. So that will give comfort to our investors, that will give comfort to the managers, that there's going to be a mechanism that you are similarly used to. But I think it's very early days, Tushar, because we still don't know how the seat of arbitration will work. What are the nuances in relation to the arbitration rules that they'll come about? So I think, if you ask me whether as an external counsel or as an internal counsel, several aspects have been addressed. But I think this is one key aspect, because this is literally, hammering the decision to the investors that all your rights as far as investing into this structure are going to be duly addressed. And I think as India, we are proud of the fact that there is rule of law out here. There is clarity in the legislative framework. So I think this one last step, if it gets addressed, I definitely will be one of the other fund managers very keen to move, as Siddharth is mentioning.
Yeah, I think, so let me come to you, Siddharth, on the same point, right? So the question which comes up as the IFSC and as you raise the fund, are the investors going to be comfortable, right? That's a question I think we get asked, Subbu gets asked, Nandini will get asked. So what is your experience on that, right? Because there are a couple of concerns, right? India, being a new structure is always a concern from an investor perspective, and enforceability. So you've been governed by the Indian law. So that becomes always a question that whether you want to be in that basket or not. But we are hearing mixed signals that some of the investors are willing to come and invest directly into IFSC fund. Some say, no, we need a feeder. And we faced the same issue, say, 10, 15 years back when it was Mauritius, right? But the investors are not comfortable in Mauritius, then you had a Cayman feeders and all that. So what's the situation What is your view on this?
I think, Tushar, therein actually lies the difference between the professional and the manager. You get inquiries, we need to give indemnities on the entire part, which is actually completely out of scope for us. But I think, see, from the investor community also, I think most investors take a large amount of comfort in the fact that IFSC is being actively backed by the government, and it does actually have a set of frameworks, a set of regulations, and the same kind of cadence that any other geography across the world actually ends up having on the same. I think given the fact that every budget, if you've actually seen for the past 6-7 years, we actually had more and more positive developments on the IFSC part, and we haven't seen a single retraction actually come about. And I think ever since the Vodafone Hutch case got settled, and the retrospective amendment, the specter of retrospective amendments was sort of at least put to rest to a large extent, there is an extended amount of comfort that ends up actually coming out over that. And I think from the fact that sovereign wealth funds across the world are actually looking to pool money in IFSC, and to end up actually coming in, there is a greater voucher confidence that they end up actually getting. A number of my investors are also making plans to actually come and meet the regulators, and they get a lot of comfort from that. So they know that I don't think politics will actually end up being what actually gets this undone. The more it is vastly embraced by everyone who's there in the industry, I don't think that's something that can actually end up getting undone throughout the entire part. We may have more IFSCs across the rest of the country, but I think GIFT IFSC will always be the first one, and they will end up actually building upon that to a large extent. One of the parts they are mentioning, as Shagoofa also mentioned, is which are the regulations that end up actually applying over there. I think with the Honorable FM's words, when they do actually get into policy and get enacted, they'll give a large amount of comfort to the LPs who are actually coming in. I think the last part, and this is not a question any of us can actually end up answering, is actually the question of stability. All of us work in long-term financial products. There's 8-10 years, you're undertaking currency risk now because it's dollar denominated, is not that much. You're undertaking a large number of risks that end up actually happening over there. So I think the crucial element for GIFT to actually become immensely successful is to ensure there's a stability of regime, and that this principle that is going to be agreement between the investor and the manager for all aspects of operations, and that will continue to be the guiding principle for regulation, will ensure that GIFT actually becomes a success. So it is a sort of wait and watch kind of mode, but I think they are getting immense amount of comfort from Indian managers who are willing to actually take that step. And after all, the role of venture capital, venture is an important part of venture capital as well. So there are investors willing to actually take that step with quality fund managers and with advice from sound professionals who can give them that added level of comfort.
I'm glad to hear that investors are ready to take that bet, because that's going to take the IFSC to the next level, right? So maybe one question to you in respect of this. So are there any advantage of investors coming in directly in IFSC funds? So maybe that gives some ammunition to Siddharth and other fund managers to have some positivity about that.
Yeah, no, true. I just wanted to supplement one point to what Siddharth said, and we've seen that play out in quite a few fund cases in the recent, I think, 2 quarters, is even the active role that DFIs and multilaterals are playing in actually pushing IFSC. They have a developmental agenda, they want the ecosystem to grow. And I think the fact that fund managers who were sitting on the sidelines, and there are many of them as we know, had to take the plunge because there was an ask from the investor to go to IFSC, I think is very heartening. I know 4 years back, when we were in the pre-IFSCA's mode, when people were trying to convince setting up, how challenging it was. But just on the specific question you had, Tushar, I think obviously from a benefit standpoint, the IFSC tax framework borrows from what was historically the AIF tax framework for venture capital and private equity funds, where a pass-through regime is available. And as you think of a more globalized, non-incentivized tax world, where most investors tend to pay taxes globally, I think the pass-through regime is aligned with the best of, the best of what is offered for funds globally. And the ability to therefore pay taxes and see through credit for investors in their home country is very valuable. Because if you have opaque structures or you have fund tax structures, that becomes challenging. So I think that's one big advantage, the fact that it's passed through. If you think of investors, and I know many funds have common investors as well, if you think of investors who are investing in multiple Indian funds, whether it's investing in IFSC or otherwise in the domestic market, the ability for them to aggregate and offset income and gains from multiple funds in a year, I think is a solid advantage, which again is not available if you set up funds in Cayman, Mauritius, Singapore, wherever else. I think on the investing side, and I think, maybe an unintended consequences or maybe intended, I don't know, Mr. Trivedi or others can comment. But we know that the budget brought in the angel tax for non-residents. Certainly something that IBCA will work to eliminate, if not dilute. And I think the big advantage for a GIFT IFSC fund is that because it is, sort of specifically exempted under the tax law from the applicability of angel tax, I think that becomes again a very important differentiator for anyone who is setting up a platform to invest in India, whether it's an India-only fund or even a global platform or a regional platform looking to allocate significant capital to India, to use an IFSC platform, because angel tax does not apply to a fund there. And I think that's probably going to be a very compelling use case, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about in the next few quarters for sure.
Thank you, Subbu. And maybe I want to add, being a tax professional myself, I want to add one more, that from a withholding tax perspective, given that you are a IFSC fund, there's no withholding tax. So you, to that extent, the indemnities and all, you can deal much easily with the other side, right?
Yeah.
So possibly that adds on to one. So maybe
I'll make sure to note that during my negotiations.
so maybe this 2-3 kind of weapons for you to kind of convince investors to come directly at IFSC. Maybe switching gears, maybe on unified structures. And the question is that in most funds now, you have given that the domestic capital is becoming more vibrant, and with the family offices coming in, the insurance money coming in, the bank money coming in. So there is always a domestic capital. Now, if you have IFSC structures for offshore capital, and you still need an AI structure for domestic capital, so should there be kind of a government should work, or IFSC should work towards single pool of capital or a unified structure in IFSC, which allows pooling of both the resident and non-resident funds? So maybe I can start with you, Shagoofa, for a change. To
Sure.
What is your view? Is this something we should aspire to be as a country? Is there something that we should push
So
the
I-
government and the regulator to allow?
So I definitely believe we should aspire for it, right? Because ultimately, what was the objective with which the GIFT City was set up? That we are going to become the service provider for people who are consuming international financial services from outside service providers. So we want to replace these other established jurisdictions. So we cannot have such a narrow vision that we will only replace them from the perspective of a feeder fund. Which means that we only set up a vehicle in GIFT City to pool offshore money to bring it into India, either into a domestic AIF or directly into Indian investment. So the answer is definitely a resounding yes, that yes, we should ensure that the GIFT City vehicle becomes a comprehensive vehicle, whereby we are able to pool domestic capital as well as offshore capital. We are able to deploy it in India, we are able to deploy it globally. But the biggest challenge out there is the underlying legal framework, that the GIFT City structure or the IFSC is a foreign currency structure, right? So if we are putting Indian resident money out there, we are expecting the Indian resident institutional and non-institutional investors to then invest in a foreign currency. So there is going to be an inherent resistance from these investors. So for example, they may not even have it in their mandate. Will the banks, will SIDBs, will people like us, where the money is domestic, want to invest into an offshore vehicle, commingle ourselves into that foreign currency vehicle, bring back that money into India? So I think today there is an inherent challenge. It is addressable from a structural point of view. It is possible that you can have the GIFT City AIF become a dual currency or a multiple currency vehicle. So there are ways to address it. Now, will this be done in phase 1 of evolution of the GIFT City regime, or will it be done in phase 2? I think we should start putting the framework for it, start debating the framework, look at what the issues need to be addressed from a legal perspective, from a tax perspective. So I'm completely in favor of that, but I think it's still early days. We may not be there soon.
Sid?
I think she actually just speak up very articulately. See, Tushar, every single structure, every single intermediate entity, anything you end up putting up adds another layer of cost, adds another layer of compliance, adds another layer of complication when it comes to a fund manager's life. We're already going through a funding winter and everything now. And I think the ability to actually commingle that capital will go a long way in actually making sure that there's alignment of interest amongst domestic investors and foreign investors, and there's transparency and cleanliness in the structure. Otherwise, now what ends up happening is you have an Indian AIF, you have a foreign one. The foreign GIFT City fund invests into Indian AIF. When can you declare the final close? What will the final fund size be? There are investors whose capital commitments are contingent on your final fund size. It's not an actual amount that ends up actually coming there. So I think having the ability, this sort of arbitrage that ends up actually artificially created arbitrage, may actually end up undoing some of the benefits that the industry is hoping that this structure GIFT will actually end up affording to all of us. So I think it's important, therefore, for us to have this kind of flexibility built in, even if it is a dollar issue or anything like that. As Shagoofa mentioned, multi-currency funds do actually exist. Most of the funds anyway have a different IRR and hurdle for your domestic capital and your non-domestic capital as part of that. And the industry is already adapted to these kind of things. So I think having that flexibility will go a long way in actually encouraging a larger number of fund managers to do that, because at the end of the day, capital is actually global, right? The color of capital is green, whether you're coming from Singapore, whether you're coming from Bangalore, whether you're coming from anywhere else. So when we start treating capital in that particular fashion, with the added safeguards that is required that India actually mandates for these kind of transactions, we will actually go a long way in ensuring that Indian capital can actually end up managing a larger portion of it onshore rather than just becoming advisors. India is a nation, if you ask me, of entrepreneurs and investors, not just advisors alone. So I think having these kind of changes will go a long way in making sure that this dream actually does become a reality for everyone.
Yeah, so philosophically speaking, we are actually doing that in India, right? You're unifying in India, so why not unify in GIFT? Now, you have the same challenges on multi-currency in India while you're dealing with foreign money as dollar capital and rupee money as rupee capital. So why not deal with the same issue? Of course, as you rightly said, there are issues around a financial institution able to invest abroad, but those are solvable, right? If the government and the regulators work together. So it's, I think we should aim for it, and we'll see whether it happens in phase 1 or phase 2, but we should hope. Yeah.
All this is still India, after all. All this is still India, right? We,
Yeah,
can't have this sort of, we should not have these sort of divisions, and as it comes to a project of national importance.
Absolutely.
So I just wanted to say that maybe one way this can be done easily, especially after the new overseas investment rules have been notified, is to introduce an accredited investor class by the government for outbound investments as well. Right, like we have for SEBI for inbound, or like we have in IFSC for pooling. So that way you're not worried about, what kind of money is going out, these are well-informed investors. The 250,000 LRS limit should not apply to these investors, right? So that's just one way that domestic capital can be
Today,
tapped.
the outbound regulation does give significant flexibility in terms of offshore investment. The whole round-tripping issue has been solved. So with all those pillars in place, why should we not aim for it, was my question. So I think we'll leave that. Possibly it happens in phase 1 or phase 2. Maybe I think we're short of time. So let me move on to one of the important aspects of fund structure, and I want to deal with how do we address that in IFSC in particular is carry, and especially the employee carry. And it ends up being, given the substance required in IFSC, you will have significant amount of people in the advisory entity in India. So how do you maybe come to Shagoofa as to what are the possible carry structures in terms of, structuring the carry, and in particular the employee carry? And maybe then a follow-on question, maybe Subbu, to you on tax side. So how do you see that plays out for tax? Is it advantages, not advantages? What's the right way to look at it? Yeah.
Sure. So as I was mentioning, Tushar, that there are certain fundamental characteristics of a fund vehicle which we need to resolve from a GIFT City perspective. And alignment of interest between the employees and the manager is one of the very critical elements, because these are long-term funds. You want to ensure that the employees are duly incentivized to stay not just through the investment period but also to the critical divestment period. So carry structures or incentivization structures become very important when you're trying to move the fund jurisdiction from, say, mainland India to the GIFT City. So today there are challenges, because from an ODI perspective, OPI perspective, how do you set up an employee trust in GIFT City? It is not going to be regarded as a regulated vehicle. The mix of employees that you will have in mainland AIF versus the GIFT City AIF is also going to be lopsided in favor either at the mainland side or the offshore side. So therefore, you want to have a pooling vehicle where both employees can participate. Now, carry is one aspect where, it's possible to maybe allocate carry points and therefore not really necessarily require a remittance of capital. But there are employees who have to bring in skin in the game, right? Because there is an expectation from the investors that the employees also match some capital into it. So I think today we have challenges because at least it is not recognized as a regulated entity. So we would be, in fact, engaging in conversation with IFSCA to permit these kind of vehicles. So while conversations are on the SPV structures, while conversations are on the VCC, I think it is very important that even the carry structures come up as critical discussions from an IFSCA perspective, because unless we close the loop on all of these aspects, it's going to be very difficult to say that yes, the structure is robust enough to ensure that it endures and is able to live the life of 15 years that we all are, expecting these long-term funds to be. So I think today, the way we would do it today is just do it as an onshore structure, and maybe have some kind of a bonus element, or maybe shadow units, or even some form of incentivization through the manager entity. So I think today we are doing a little bit of contrived structures as options, but the ask is that we should have a duly approved structure for employee trusts in the GIFT City to be recognized as regulated entities.
Sure. Maybe, so you want to touch upon?
I'll just supplement on the tax side. So I think, as Shagoofa mentioned, obviously setting up a straightforward structure is not feasible today from a regulatory standpoint. So regulations need to get liberalized. And today, if you look at it broadly, there are institutional funds which have greater challenges in terms of the kind of structures you can do, versus, there's slightly more flexibility if you're a fund which is more individual GP promoted, because they can use the partnerships in some sense to get your carry. So ultimately, the taxation of carry will depend on the legal form it takes. Of course, if it goes back to the manager, typically carry is a pass-through income from the fund back to the manager, so you get taxed similarly. Of course, you can evaluate whether there's a feasibility of getting the profit-linked exemption that's available for fund managers or, units in IFSC. And avail a full exemption, but that seems more challenging. So that would be one. Of course, a big positive on carry, which I think is also partly a driver for a lot of foreign capital finding its way into GIFT structures, is the fact that the whole controversy that the domestic industry is facing on GST goes away when it comes to GIFT. So whichever way that controversy lands up
Also
after
the characterization.
Court, yeah, the characterization also goes away. So that's a big plus, and I think from a tax perspective, that is one of the big drivers to consider GIFT in the first place.
I think we have run out of time, so maybe I'm going to stop my discussion here. Maybe last question to all of you, that of course there's a lot of movement in terms of IFSC. We've seen more than 50 fund managers taking the plunge into it, but still there's a lot of kind of question marks. So if you were to say have one ask to the government or IFSC authority in terms of IFSC fund setup, what would that be? So maybe yours would be Carrie, is it?
Carrie, maybe there's ask two, but ask one I think is enforceability. I think this is a question from a legal perspective that needs redressal, and needs redressal soon. We can't wait for funds to start setting up and then get into the domain of addressing dispute resolution situations. So big ask, one ask if you ask me, a comprehensive solution from an enforceability dispute resolution perspective.
Sure. Nandini?
So to add to what Shagoofa said, I think a variable capital company structure will go a long way towards enforceability as well. And that's been pending, so I hope that comes out soon, both in IFSC.
Sure. Have IFSC take over the parts of the tax department in GIFT. I think that'll be the major one. But jokes aside, I think the biggest thing I see needs to maintain in GIFT is make the process of onshore fund managers setting up in GIFT a lot more seamless, which I think the single window clearance that was announced in the budget should do. I think if that ends up happening, then the ability for a manager to launch either in mainland India or in GIFT, and if becomes simple. And the moment that the time difference goes down, I think we'll actually truly unleash the power of Indian intellect when it comes to managing capital. I think that's going to be an inflection point for the entire country as well.
I think from a tax practitioner's viewpoint, and I think it was an expectation in the budget, I think finally the IFSC is coming off its own, moving away from the SEBI AIF regulations. And for a lot of the innovative products that IFSC fund management regulations envisage, I think having a comprehensive tax code which is standing on its own, I think is critical for the future of that segment. I think we have good solutions today, but I think taking it to the next level will need that, independent tax code to make it work.
Thank you. With that, let me close the panel, and thank you very much for sharing your insight into this important topic. Thank you. Thank you.